All right, everyone, welcome back. Um, Last week, Ethan, I don't even know if you're aware of this. I did a solo cast, the first official solo cast, which was really the topic is not too relevant. It was just my take on the whole science-based thing. A lot of people have been talking about it. And I was shocked by the response to the solo cast. We had some very positive reviews, but there were some reviews which expressed somewhat of an existential crisis around your absence. They said, "Where's Ethan? Is Ethan gone? Is Ethan not coming back?"
Yeah, that makes me feel good. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely uh, boosts my self-confidence and makes me want to continue joining you here.
All
And
right,
we'll say that, it wasn't my fault that I wasn't there.
that's
Uh,
correct. Yeah, I take responsibility for that. Yeah. Um, yeah, and the other thing too is like I think that's something we can intentionally do. It's kind of like how people structure video games. They basically what they do is they give you enough of the satisfaction and the reward, and then what they do is there's a delay period to make you start to want the thing again. So it's kind of like maybe every 20 episodes we'll do a Ben solo cast so
or
people can
yeah,
right, just like a little bit of, Ethan for a while, ooh, take him away and then reintroduce him. I think that'll be a good
yeah.
strategy.
I mean, we got a couple shows coming up, so we have an opportunity again, and
Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Inevitably. Um, so today, as you know, we're going to talk about this topic of majoring in the minors, which for those of you who don't know or who have maybe not heard that kind of a phrase before, um, it's kind of the what comes up a lot of the times with people who are maybe just getting introduced to stuff from an education perspective, maybe people who haven't, done a ton of research just because maybe it's not their field or maybe they just haven't invested a lot of time in it. A lot of these kinds of majoring in the minors things come up when I think we have questions that are not appropriately contextualized. And I think a lot of that we'll talk about today in terms of, Ethan, your model of understanding that. But just to kind of describe what we're talking about in more of an example, because I think that's an easier way to describe it is like, and this will happen a lot with me where people will ask me specific questions about anatomy that are not just specific, but that are almost like hyper specific to a particular trend that is current in the fitness industry. The sort of soundbite thing where someone, on the internet somewhere will make a claim about an exercise doing a particular thing. Training a specific portion of a muscle. For example, like if someone is doing a triceps extension, they'll say this extension is for the long head of the triceps. It's not for the other two heads. So if you're going to do this one, make sure your goals are in the long head of the triceps. And so someone will see that, and then they'll send it to me, and they'll say, Ben, what do you think of this? Does this exercise target the long head of the triceps? And that kind of question, I think, is the kind of question that we're sort of alluding to when we talk about majoring in the minors, which isn't to say that these questions are unimportant, but rather it's more so like um, to, someone who is in a position where they can't really, even if they did get an appropriate answer to the question, they wouldn't really be in a position for it to be useful to them or really for them to understand it and contextualize it within a larger framework of understanding. And so, with that particular example, a lot of times the question will be hyper specific to a muscle, but the person to begin with might not know where any of the muscles in that group attach, right? So in the triceps example, what will commonly be the interaction? This has happened more times than you would believe. Um, I'll ask something in return, just like, hey, so like, what are the differences between the heads? Like, what makes you say that? And someone won't necessarily even know that like the long head crosses the shoulder or that the other two heads don't cross the shoulder, right? So you've taken this situation where you now are having questions that are so high level relative to maybe where people need to be. And again, it's not that those high level questions aren't relevant or that they're not important, but rather just the kind of question I think oftentimes is not super appropriate for the person asking the question. And a vast majority of the time that people that are seeing the most amount of results, they're not really tending to focus too much on those kinds of things, at least in a lot of cases. And so it's kind of created this very confusing situation. And I actually think that what we're talking about today is kind of the root in many ways of like the anti-science trend, where a lot of people who are super far like nerdy science people are just really interested in the topics and they're asking these questions out of interest. And they're not really implying that these things are going to be like the highest ROI topics to invest time in. But, the people on the other end of the spectrum who are kind of like just do the basics, just train hard, they kind of almost get like they have this like uncomfortable reaction to it because they know that like these are not the kinds of questions that ultimately I think yield the highest return on investment in terms of what to be talking about and what to be asking about. So it's interesting how this kind of relates to the topic of last week that I talked about, which was the science versus anti-science thing, because I think a lot of the times the lack of context in these kinds of questions is where the root of that issue really comes from and where a lot of the confusion between sides comes from, because you have these people over here that are asking questions that seem totally irrelevant on one end, but that are really just interesting at the same time. And then you have people on the other end who don't think about any of that stuff and they seem to be just getting, the same or better results to the people who are asking those questions. So I don't know if exactly that made perfect sense, but I think that was a decent example, at least to sort of start with. And I wanted to sort of hand this off to you and start by asking like this kind of question, right? The kind of question that we're talking about with the triceps specific example. Have you, let's say, over the last like 5 to 10 years, personally observed an increase in the volume of those questions? And if you have, how do you sort of maybe navigate just thinking about it overall when you're interacting with people who are maybe asking those kinds of questions? And so have you seen a change in it over time? And if you have, I'm kind of interested to hear your thought process about maybe why that's happened or anything else related.
Well, the real like confounding variable for me is that the bigger that I get, the more likely people are to ask me questions.
Physically, yeah,
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 yeah, yeah.
right. So it's just like when you're
True.
doing the part, people come up to you, on the street, on the gym, in the bathroom, and want to ask, a whole range of questions. So I think I can't say, based on my own personal experience, certainly like this is, what I hear, and this is kind of like maybe what I observe, sort of like in dialogue online. But I think like this, sort of push and pull between, science and practice is, overall a positive thing and something that has always happened and will always, continue to happen. And when you're in the middle of it, it probably feels like a relatively new thing, but I think it just comes in cycles, and, it's one kind of pushes ahead of the other one for a little bit, and they just kind of, go back and forth. Um, but one of the things I wanted to comment on is just like, the archetype of the person asking these sort of questions, and just how hard it is to actually identify, um, you know, which people are sort of focusing on the right things and therefore like get the results that you're observing, and whether them focusing on those things is actually, producing that result. So what I mean by that is just like, it is one of the biggest issues, that we have in this field is a lack of an ability to measure, especially acutely, the outcomes that we're looking for. So, with me on the podcast, obviously we're talking about building muscle most of the time. And, we're not particularly accurate, or reliable on an individual level to be able to measure that longitudinally, let's say on the, time span of, 8+ weeks. We can do a decent job, with larger and larger sample sizes, but to take an individual and say, okay, they put on this much muscle across time is still not something that like we're really good at. And on top of that, it's like we have, numerous inputs that we're putting into this black box. And then we're trying to measure this outcome that's very far removed from behavior. And we talked a little bit about this with things like diet, for example, right? Like it would be great, if it was like getting a tan, where, you go and tan, maybe you're at the beach or whatever, you're just outside for the day. And the next day, you can observe that adaptation, right? You can see your skin's getting darker. It happens over the course, of a few days to a week or so. And if you did too much, you can also see yourself start to peel and get red. It's a very like observable, stimulus and response where, and it's also, it is multifactorial in terms of like your genes influence your ability to tan, like the, time of day, the cloudiness, and on and on and on. Like there are many factors going into how tan you get, but the adaptation happens, relatively quickly. It's very observable. And it's also, something that you can very easily titrate, where it's like, oh, I can see that I did a little bit too much, pull it back. And it's just not like that with exercise, so, or nutrition, or, sort of anything in these related fields where, oh, I had a good day of eating today and all of a sudden I look better tomorrow, or I did this exercise and I can tell that this exercise grew me more than that exercise. It's difficult enough across time with all of the factors going in to know what did what. But it's even more difficult, on a rep by rep, set by set, workout by workout basis to know all of the inputs going in, how they're affecting each other, what sort of counter-regulatory mechanisms are going on. So it's like, yeah, all this stuff matters, but the most difficult part is measuring it. So what we really end up with is like these proxy measures that are pretty far removed from the stimulus and aren't even particularly accurate on their own, right? It's like when we're trying to measure hypertrophy in the real world, it's like, oh, we're looking at a picture, we're taking circumference or skin folds or what have you, but we're really just like in the stone age of measuring these things. And we're very far, we're talking about like, a set is a set and we count sets like, oh, when I bench press, that's a set for triceps. And we just have no idea for a specific individual at a specific moment in time, you know, what that stimulus did and what are all the like downstream effects of that signal. So what we end up with is just saying like, this thing doesn't really matter, this thing matters, and it all matters. It's just like, what can we actually observe? So what we're left with is just these like big picture behaviors where we're like, okay, we can see like across time, both in practice, and in the research, like when people generally engage in these behaviors, they move, in this direction. But we're not sure of, all the little details and all the interactions happening on a moment to moment basis. So that's where some of the most common, I think, you know, limitations or like kind of misnomers, come up in terms of like framing these questions correctly is we're focused on things that are very acute variables. And whether it's in research and you're trying to look at a specific hormone or you're trying to look, even at like a specific food, like we said in nutrition, you're trying to isolate one variable and look at it at a snapshot in time. And, most of the time, we call this like mechanistic research. And then we try to, relate that to what's going to happen in practice longitudinally or across time. And, just in general, we want to look at like what's the actual like long-term adaptation we get because we don't know when we put in this one input everything else that's interacting with it. And a lot of the ways that we've gone astray with science over time is by focusing on something that we see acutely, that we can measure, and then we try to correlate that, whether it be, like protein synthesis, for example, or whether it be EMG, for example. And we say, oh, this, EMG is higher here, so this is a better exercise. Protein synthesis, maxes out here, so that's the maximum amount of protein. There is a refractory period every so many hours, so we can only eat this many times. And then it's like, whoa, but wait, in practice, like, that's not what we see. People are eating way more protein. They're eating it, way more frequently. They are, they're finding many ways, to roam. And it just shows that there's a lot more for us to sort of sort through here. And I think it makes this question that I started with very difficult to sort of parse through in terms of like who's in front of us asking this question. Like, is this someone who's, you know, really advanced and they're just at the top of the pyramid now where they're looking for those, you know, extra few percentage points, and that's where they're asking the nuanced question? Is it someone who's, you know, sort of anti-science, more on the bro side? And like, yeah, on one hand, they're sort of refuting the idea of looking to the science for evidence. But on the other hand, they're doing a lot of practices that likely aren't, you know, producing any measurable progress for them. So those same people also have lots of behaviors that aren't even generally accepted within their own community. It's like, you know, I think that this is the best fish for me to build muscle. You know, I found through experience that, you know, tilapia is better than orange roughy, or, you know, steak is better than ground beef, or whatever. And you could argue like, look, you know, this person has tried it on themselves, they've tested it, and they have their own way of sort of measuring, you know, the effectiveness they get out of it. And maybe in some cases, you know, that's correct, but in a lot of cases, you know, they do end up majoring in minors as well, so to speak. They're just different than the ones, you know, that the more
Hmm.
like typically inclined people are. So everyone is kind of, you know, tends to major in the minors somewhere. Even at, you know, the elite level of sport, you know, having worked with professional athletes and having lots of friends that are in that realm, most of them are successful despite these habits. You know, I would say like my experience is the majority of them eat like shit. And a lot of times they sleep like shit. And a lot of the behaviors that we really focus on as a fitness community tend to be, you know, lacking largely, you know, in sort of like the upper echelon of sport. And then you have a few people at the very top who both, you know, have that genetic potential, have the right environment, and, you know, are doing all those behaviors. But in general, it's pretty few and far between. So you can't necessarily, my point is like, you can't necessarily look at someone's progress and say this person is muscular or this person is at the top of their sport and assume that they are focusing on the right things, because there are so many interacting factors happening that we can't possibly know which of those factors, you know, are ultimately contributing to their success.
Yeah, so that's great. And I want to sort of just backtrack for a second before we dive more specific here with a couple different examples. Um, Two of the main things that I think really contribute to and exacerbate this issue are the formal education system and then also social media. And so those of us, and I want to recognize just contextually that going through a long-term formal education process is something that not everyone in the world has access to. So like with that sort of caveat made, I realize that there are people who don't have an opportunity to go through the formal education process, and it's still sort of a natural inclination to ask these kinds of questions. But I do find that via the traditional model of schooling, what we're sort of raised to think is that if I have a question, I can um, find a way to answer this question with a check or a check plus or a check minus or or a zero, right? And so when you receive information back, you got a B on the test, or you got an A on the test, or you got an F on the test. You either did know the correct answers or you did not know the correct answers. So we for so long are taught to sort of think in this binary kind of a way without sort of context. And to some degree, I understand why assessing learning that way is necessary. But so much of the time when people come out of formal education, whether it's like just, undergraduate work or college education, or like, graduate work and even beyond, we come out with this idea that, these kinds of questions can be sort of labeled with a check or a check minus or something like that. And I think that that sort of actually feeds in directly to the second one, which is social media, which, by necessity, in order to make a piece of content, right, you have to decide that there's a specific question or there's a specific topic that you think is worth putting out into the world. And usually the way that content is framed without people realizing it. There's always this frame of like, what I'm talking about really is the thing that you kind of need, right? And so when people go from directly formal education into social media, or more likely both are happening at the same time, there's just this constant reinforcement of like, these are the sort of black and white things that you need to know. And a lot of times, because of the nature of social media, people end up sort of dipping into the more, we'll say, nuanced, sort of higher order topics that are maybe not super foundational. It's not particularly sexy, on social media to talk about. In the case of exercise, it's not super sexy to talk about, moment arms and torque, right? No one wants to like feel like they're reading a physics textbook to learn how to actually, understand exercise. So we end up talking about things like stretch mediated hypertrophy, like the pump, like all these more specific topics that are likely influential in some way, but that in terms of their importance are drastically magnified, because it's kind of all of what people are seeing on social media are these kinds of questions. It's not the more foundational questions of like, well, are you sleeping? Are you, people know sort of on some level the information they need to understand most of the time to see a lot, to see the results that they're looking for. But I think via the formal education system and via the way that social media by nature actually is, we are constantly reinforcing this idea that there are like these super, super sort of small topics that like will make differences that are huge in their outcome, regardless of the fact that most of the times, in terms of their impact, they won't. And so I think one of the frames that I have used a lot recently when trying to address these questions, just in, especially if it's like an interpersonal one-on-one, consultation or something, in that instance, you have an opportunity to sort of tease through a lot of the stuff that's on the surface via like good questions, like, okay, where did you hear this? Where do you think this fits in? What do you know about this topic to begin with? You can get really specific, but on a general level, it's very difficult to address those things, right? Because it can never be specific to a single person. And so one of the frames that you often take when answering these kinds of questions, and even, some of the time, I sort of, I think, will say I miss the forest for single trees on topics that I'm not particularly informed about, and you kind of pull me back and are able to contextualize things in a way that is, makes sense to me. And the way that you often do that is through a discussion of like this sort of rate limiter concept. So oftentimes I hear just in the background like someone asking you a nutrition question, and you always kind of harken back to like, okay, where are you currently at and where are you coming from? And what do you think right now is actually preventing you from moving forward? Because oftentimes there's a very obvious sort of rate limiter to your progress. And I think that you can apply that rate limiter concept to pretty much any one of these kinds of topics that you can talk about, be it nutrition, training, hypertrophy, whatever. So can you just talk a little bit about that rate limiter framework that you have in terms of like how you go about approaching those questions broadly, and then we can jump into specific examples that sort of were the impetus for this conversation to begin with.
Yeah. So just kind of framing this in terms of like being consistent with what you were saying about social media and, the formal education system. I think these are avenues which, we gain competence through, right? Like, there's this thing called self-determination theory, which, neither of us are, psychologists that we're really, going to spend a lot of time talking about this stuff. But at the end of the day, like, um, if we're going to talk about setting a specific goal and understanding like what are the limitations to that goal, a person still has to be, motivated and, somehow be able to frame this thing in their mind. So when we talk about, formal education or social media, these are ways for us to gain competence, to basically feel like, if there's an issue, if there is a limiter, if there's something we need to solve for, that it's possible to do so. That information is out there. Whether you do it by asking, the big guy at the gym, or whether you do that, with the textbook, or whether you do that by, DMing Ben, like, there's some degree of like, I can gain competence in this subject. I have the ability to do so. And then also whether you're, in school with a bunch of people studying the same topic or you're online in a community, you also have this relatedness factor where everyone's kind of working towards, the same general thing. So those are big in terms of like, you know, uh, driving a person towards a specific goal, which is really the crux of all this. And then there's also just like a person's autonomy, right? Like your ability to feel like you're in control, of, your own behaviors, destiny, like, and feeling like, you're steering the ship, right? And I think when it comes to like social media, for example, and other people just telling you this is the way it is, this is good or this is bad, you do lose a little bit of that sense of just like the self exploration and keeping things simple, so to speak, and seeing the results of that patiently over time. um so with that autonomy piece and sort of moving towards a very specific goal with those other factors of the competence and relatedness in play, now you're a person who ideally has, some degree of like intrinsic motivation to work towards a specific thing, a specific goal. And now you have a direction. And, once you have a direction, once you have like this, some semblance of, an endpoint, whether it's near or far, then you can work backwards. And I think that's where a lot of this needs to be framed, is not about like what is best, but about working backwards from where you're trying to go. And I find when working with people in practice, that is the most common limitation I see. Either that they're lacking in those first few things that I mentioned in terms of like actually being, motivated enough to pursue this and, be compliant, which is, always the number one limitation in the bottom of the pyramid. Or they haven't really established like where are we trying to go and in what time frame. And once you do that, it's much easier to sort of fill in the puzzle, right? It's like you frame things, you have an idea of what this puzzle looks like, and you can start saying, okay, we have the corner pieces, we sort of know the clouds go up here and the grass goes down here, and then all of a sudden, you're two-thirds of the way done and the pieces just start falling into place really quickly. And that's what it feels like when you're designing a program that starts with a goal and you work backwards and you work within the constraints that you have. Because if you don't, you get questions like, what's optimal, what's best? And then you now have to tell the person, like, what's optimal for what, who, what, when, where, et cetera. So it always has to be framed in the context of the person and where they're going. And then that avoids, almost that sort of circumvents, just about all of these questions. And we're working backwards. We've, now not only framed it in terms of where we want to go, but also what are your limitations? And a lot of people too that are asking very non-specific questions aren't doing so in the context of their most obvious limitations. I have X amount of time to train, per week, per day, etc. Therefore, how should I take rest periods? Therefore, how should I split up, my body parts? I'm trying to, gain weight, or I'm trying to lose weight, or, my digestion has been very poor, or my appetite is very poor. Um, you know, uh, Finances are or are not an issue. Like all of these things go into just framing each decision. And a lot of these questions become very obvious, even if you're not entirely informed on the science, when you're working backwards from a specific goal and the constraints that you lay out.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that you mentioned there, um, that I find is super underrated is just this idea of, not even necessarily having a perfectly defined endpoint, but at least an aim.
Mhm.
And a lot of times, I think people who do not have a particular aim when they ask a specific question are are just looking for an answer rather than something that can inform them in a direction, right? Because if there's no direction and you ask something like, well, what are you trying to do? Then it kind of just seems like you are trying to dodge the question, right? And it's weird how over time I've noticed more and more, the more that I respond with a certain kind of question, and this is uh, most exaggerated in public comment sections, be it on Instagram or YouTube, whatever, where someone will make a comment and I'll try to ask a question in return to get context for where that person is coming from, and then all of a sudden a bunch of people will come in and just be like, "Oh, well, Ben doesn't know the answer," and it's like that's kind of the whole point, right? Is that we don't, and that's very uncomfortable, I think for all of us. And the point about autonomy, I think, is a really good, or rather, a really important point to make in this context, which is like, I remember this is probably about 3 years ago now, where I was at a point where I was like, we were going to start to train together. And I asked you something like, well, Ethan, do you think that I should like cut off this bit of fat that like I have on, so then I can start, progressing, toward my goal. And you sort of asked me similar kinds of questions to what we're describing now, which is like, well, what is actually, your end goal? And where do you think it makes sense to start based on where you are right now? And I think a lot of people are in that place of like, well, I have some stubborn fat, but like ultimately I want to build muscle, right? But those things are sort of equal and opposite. And if you try to strike the middle, you end up doing neither. And you end up sort of just, circling around the same point. And to the point about autonomy, I think a lot of the times the reason why that's a question to begin with, and specifically why you see, at least what I see a lot of now, is like people just bulking and cutting like every 6 weeks. Oh, let me do this 1 week like micro cut, or let me do this 4 week rapid bulk, and then I'm gonna shred it all off for summer or whatever. That just, I think, gives people a sense of like movement where there might not necessarily be the clear outcome and the clear feedback, to your point earlier, where you see this long term. Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I can appreciate the idea of movement, right? Like,
Yeah.
especially if you're dealing with someone who's been training for a really long time, they're natural, and it's like, on a time scale that's really impossible for us, to measure anything acutely. Like, I do think there is absolutely, the underlying concept again is just like being motivated, being excited. And a lot of times that's just changing anything. It's like if you're not progressing, change something, anything, and
Hmm.
we don't always know what the exact answer is, but just start by changing something. And when it's someone very early, in their training career, a lot of times, that might be happening too often. And ironically, the people that are further on tend to be more comfortable with not observing, those acute fluctuations. But many times in practice, like I do have to choose the thing that is going to be most exciting for the person. Ideally, you could do that through like a shift in environment, but sometimes it is just like, what do you see in the mirror?
Hmm. Yeah. And just to give maybe one more example, that's a little bit more generalized before we jump into a specific topic here, is I was talking to Tom a couple days ago, and Tom Purvis, for people listening, and we were kind of talking about this exact topic just because it was on my mind, and we were having some back and forth. And he brought up this specific example of someone who he took a lot of his employees on like a ski trip in the 90s. And there was this one guy who like knew everything about every mechanical element of the skis, like all the different types of equipments. And they get out there on the slopes, and this is the guy who like knows it all in theory, and then goes on to the slopes and is like a total it's like a total disaster. It's like someone who knows everything about a car but doesn't know how to start the car to kind of begin with. So this topic overall came about from a question that we had in the community, and it was about the hormone hypothesis thing, and specifically the question about how hormones are, or at least so we think, like hormones are this really important thing. And based on this hormone hypothesis, which may influence our training in some ways, what kinds of exercises or what kinds of programs can I do to sort of maximize the hormone response across different exercises. So can you just kind of just first outline like what the whole hormone hypothesis is? Because I think you can explain it much better than I can. And then kind of how this fits into the conversation in terms of maybe where that kind of question is potentially misdirected and where it can lead people down directions that are not necessarily helpful or practical.
Yeah, I think like, in the 90s, early 2000s, I mean, you literally had our sort of like exercise science, governing bodies, so to speak, making recommendations about how to train, in this case, for hypertrophy based on acute fluctuations, in hormones. Again, sort of the more mechanistic and acute variables to, um, outside of, just looking longitudinally at like, okay, maybe we should be focusing more on, performance outcomes versus, measuring internal variables, right? Like the holy grail would be that we can measure things internally in the moment that inform us directly about the adaptation we're going to get later. And we're just not at that point yet. Again, you could do a set, and it could tell you how effective that was and how many sets you need to do. Maybe we'll get there someday. But the idea was basically like your rest periods influence, for example, things like, cortisol, growth hormone output, the load on the bar in terms of, percentage of one rep max, may influence things like testosterone. And, I think largely the idea comes from like observing enhanced bodybuilders, making so much progress by using exogenous hormones and super physiological levels, and then relating that to, well, on a smaller scale, this must be, what happens with exercise. Therefore, if we can get a little bit of that response that, pro bodybuilders are getting, by manipulating variables in our training, then, theoretically that should be the best way to train. And like I mentioned, we see this in many other areas. For example, nutrition, looking at protein synthesis. Um, and, basically, upon, further examination, just like, in nutrition, it was like, oh, we're kind of missing the forest for the trees here. And, now we know that, for example, like shorter rest periods, it's pretty intuitive that that will decrease, performance. And, if you are, chronically putting yourself in a place of decreased, performance, and you're not accounting for that in other ways, be it, more sets, or be it, again, that concept of limiters where, yeah, if you're doing a big circuit of squat, bench, et cetera, and, your cardiovascular system, your overall just like systemic fatigue, is limiting the number of reps you can get. Ultimately, like that total output, that total workload is just a much bigger factor, in, in terms of gaining muscle long term than any acute fluctuations in hormones. But I think sometimes that can also get taken too far, where you just say, well, therefore hormones don't matter, right? Where it's kind of the person who's on, the periphery of science is like, well, we've already established like the hormone hypothesis is wrong and hormones are just irrelevant for muscle growth. And it's like, well, that's not true either, right? Like we know at the extremes, clearly, like it matters. So if you're hypogonadal, or, you're taking exogenous testosterone in super physiological doses, like that's pretty impactful, either in a negative or a positive direction for muscle growth. Um, but also like even these, diurnal like fluctuations in hormones do have an effect on our adaptations. Like we do get growth hormone release at night, and, that still has an impact on our ability, to build, muscle, like repair, things like connective tissue, etc. And it's not that they're irrelevant, it's just when you're trying to influence other behaviors that have downstream consequences, they can overwhelm, how important that is. So yeah, small fluctuations that are impacted maybe by, taking a supplement, for example, don't seem to play out because there's just all these other, downstream consequences that sort of, negate the, overall power of that behavior. But these, let's just take hormones, for example, like they are still modifiers, like they are still, taking this initial signal of, let's say, for one example, like mechanical tension, and they're still augmenting that signal, right? Like there's still a number of, chemical influences that are ultimately leading to, this adaptation downstream that, yeah, we can't know all of them and we can't measure them all and know how they're all interacting and basically go in and fine tune those right now. But that's not to say that they don't have an impact on hypertrophy. It's just there's so many things going on at once that it's difficult to know, what's happening where. So it's kind of like, the conversation with, metabolic stress and mechanical damage, you know, we can't separate those really well from tension. So oftentimes just said, well, they don't matter. And it's like we don't know that either because it's all happening simultaneously and certain things are upregulating other things. And there's all these consequences that are happening downstream where things are being dialed up and dialed down, where it's not just one signal, again, where we want black and white, good and bad. The signal is mechanical tension. It's like, well, yeah, just an easy example would be that mechanical tension without the nutrition, to support it isn't going to get you very far. So it's like, is it the nutrition, that's increasing insulin? No, it's like, it's not just insulin. Is it the protein that's increasing, protein synthesis? No, it's not just, proteins. So it's not that none of those things are factors that are sort of augmenting that response. It's just there's a lot of damn factors, and we can't, sort of look at them all at the same time and understand exactly, where to, sort of interfere with that system.
Yeah, and I think an important point to touch on there in terms of this conversation more broadly is the term mechanism or mechanistic, because I think that the term mechanism is often, thrown around as like this equals that sort of a thing, right? So if mechanism is in place, then that equals this other thing. And you see this a lot of times. Um, Lane Norton is someone for reference who does a really good job of like pointing out when people in, the social media space are basing their entire opinion of something off of a single mechanism, which may or may not be included in. See, people watching are going to be like, okay, there's a cat on a leash, right? But people listening are going to miss out on that. So I feel badly. There was just a cat on a leash. I actually saw two cats yesterday because it was so nice out, I guess. Two cats were being walked outdoors. One of which was leashed, one of which was free rein. And then in addition to those two cats, I actually saw a pig who
Hmm.
was
Yeah.
who was on a leash.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess some weird things happen. It's like when you go from like a clowny, shitty series of rainy days to then there's this one nice day. It's like everyone just comes out of their little holes. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But anyway, anyway, this word mechanism, to get back on track, is super important to understand because a mechanism is simply just like a mechanism describes the way that something works, right? So you can appropriately identify a mechanism of action, but whether or not that mechanism will lead to this gross outcome is an entirely different conversation. So an example that has come up recently in the lifting space is this mechanism of like just broadly talking about motor unit recruitment as if motor unit recruitment equals hypertrophy. So the way this has come up more recently is like, okay, if I'm going to do a leg extension, I could do it two legs at the same time, or I could do it one leg at a time. And the claim is basically, well, you should do the one-legged thing because mechanistically that will increase the amount of motor unit recruitment as compared to two legs. Like if you're just focusing on one thing, you have fewer things to focus on. But even if that in theory were the case, that doesn't necessarily mean that doing something single leg because more motor unit recruitment equals better outcome. And so I think what we're really ultimately talking about here is the distance, the change between describing a single mechanism, which may have truth to it, to then what you're describing, where, well, now you have to consider all of the different thousands of mechanisms and the way that they're interacting with one another to identify how this might actually influence an outcome. And that is not something that is solvable, right? That is not something that, necessarily we can always know. And even if we do get more data on the interaction between mechanisms, that still doesn't tell us in an individual scenario, what the outcome will be. And it doesn't give us a predictive power, in any individual context. So, do you just have any comments or thoughts on that, on the word mechanism, and really just that how that has sort of maybe muddied the water in some ways here?
Well, I guess what we would do in practice with that leg extension example is like, the best evidence we would have is if you compare a single leg extension, to bilateral leg extension, in a large group of people across time, and you observe, one's better than the other. But a good proxy, for an individual trying to answer that question, who doesn't really have the ability to directly measure muscle mass well, would just be to say, like, well, which one am I stronger on? Like which one gives me better performance? And there can be some confounders with that as well. But if you find, for example, like, oh, when I use, one leg, I can use, 30% more weight, than I could with two legs, in terms of, like, if you obviously split the weight in half, I can use, you know, 100 pounds with two legs, or I can use, 70 pounds or whatever with one leg. Um, that would, I think, be a reasonable rationale. Again, there may be things you're missing, like, the anchoring concept, for example, but at least that's a more reasonable place to start from than the whole, like, motor unit conversation, because you have to make a lot of leaps to get there. Whereas you could say, all right, I think it's a lot more founded, to say that, like, if I can get better performance, that's probably a good sign, at least a better sign that, I can make more progress.
Yeah, and in the nutrition space, that just becomes, I think, more and more and more ugly in terms of all the different variables, right? Because someone will, some guru who's selling some supplement online will say, well, if you eat this food, then this is the pathway that will occur after eating this food because of these different, nutritional elements. And because that pathway occurs, that will lead to this thing over here, and that will lead to then this thing over here, which is usually described as some kind of bad outcome, right, or negative consequence. And then that will be taken just in isolation from all the data that we currently have. And a lot of times it usually goes against the grain, and you get people making these very broad sweeping claims. Like a really popular one now is like the seed oil thing, where people extrapolate this whole different line of logic based off of a single mechanism, wherein it's like, okay, we have all this data through randomized control trials, which doesn't seem to, in terms of outcomes, support that mechanistic theory. And so that's where things, it can sort of fall apart. Did you have anything else to say in terms of the hormone stuff or the hormone hypothesis? Like, I'm interested kind of also in, like, how you would maybe navigate that conversation with someone, in terms of just the specific line of questioning. Like, I'm assuming that you would start from a place of, like, questioning where that person is sort of at in terms of where they are and where they're trying to go. But is there anything else just before we get to that part of the conversation that you wanted to say on the hormone stuff, or anything to add there?
Well, in practice, I would just say, look, we have, good evidence to support the idea that improving your performance over time, within a given loading range, um, is a meaningful factor for muscle growth. And when you design your training around these other factors that are more focused on, acute hormone fluctuations, we do have enough evidence at this point to, dispute those claims. So just that in practice, I would be focused on your performance more so than on, what hormones might be released, with a given behavior. And this just goes outside of training too, right? Like people will say, oh, the sauna, increases growth hormone. And, I could go into even the mechanistic reasons why that's not relevant for what they're talking about. And it's like, if we were in the sauna for a long time and it was maybe, me and someone, who was another trainer that like I could have an intelligent conversation with, I might explain to them, the difference in growth hormones role in that scenario versus in say like a nocturnal setting, right? And just
Mm.
specific that is to the environment that it's put in. um, but you could also zoom out again and just be like, well, what are we observing, in the sauna? Like you were observing like an increased, you know, heart rate or increased, perspiration. And maybe let's focus on like, what are the potential consequences of those things versus saying like, oh, well, what fluctuations are happening in order to get that response.
Yeah, it makes sense. So I want to give just a little bit more of a concrete example, just as like a back and forth, a theoretical between you and I. So you kind of knowing where I'm at with my training, right? I'm in a situation where for the last however long, I have not been particularly focused on moving in a direction in terms of growing or losing weight. I'm very happy with kind of where I'm at, just like physically. I'm enjoying training. I'm enjoying the process of just experimenting with new ideas and applying those ideas to people, in the community, et cetera. So sort of knowing where I'm at and, just pretending like I don't really think about where I'm at. If I come to you as Ben, who's kind of like is missing the forest kind of a thing, and I say to you, Ethan, like I've heard about this new supplement and it's like a natural testosterone booster, or I've heard about this supplement. We could even take creatine, but maybe that's not the best example, right? I, as person who has not, thought a ton about where I'm currently at and where I'm going, I come to you, Ethan, and I'm like, hey, dude, here's this supplement, and it's supposed to like help me grow, right? How do you initiate that conversation? Like, how do you answer that initial question of like, should I take this or should I not? What's a sort of practical application of what we've talked about so far in that particular, in this particular circumstance?
So I think the practical implication really becomes more of like a psychology question. So there's, two ways you can sort of go about answering this. Like, what's the reality of the evidence? And then, who's in front of you and how do you talk to that person? Which again is not like something, we're obviously qualified and experienced to talk about, but not necessarily in, sort of the research, right?
Yeah, medical disclaimer. Medical disclaimer.
The most effective thing, like in my case, is just going to be like, well, I don't take it. You know what I mean? Like, let's say, right? Like, and that's just kind of enough. It's like, well, that's, I do, everything I can to maximize hypertrophy, but I don't take, X, Y, Z. And, whereas the more scientific answer would just be like, look, there's been, a meta-analysis on this, specific supplement, that's kind of like, you know, most of the time like our highest tier of research, and it just doesn't support, the outcome that you're looking for. Even in this case, let's say it is moderately effective for testosterone, which, many of them are, it doesn't seem to build muscle across time. So if your goal is to build muscle, um, you know, we have good evidence to show that doesn't happen.
Okay, so then alternative scenario, assuming now I am someone who can't necessarily grasp what you're trying to talk about in terms of the objective qualities of maybe the research, or maybe I don't give a shit about what you particularly take, or maybe you're just now envision yourself as a mortal who is, does not have the amount of muscle on your frame that you do. Uh, this, I think, specifically is most problematic for personal trainers who have clients that are not at all interested in, creating a more sensible framework. They're kind of more interested in the quick fix answer of like the check or the check minus kind of a thing. How in the case of, let's say like a client type interaction like that, where it's maybe you don't have those other options, just practically speaking, um, how do you go about navigating those circumstances wherein you're not necessarily able to go that direction? I'm assuming that it's more of like the psychological thing and more of like a sequence of questions, but Tell me more about that if I'm sort of missing something there.
I mean, a lot of times it does apply to supplements very often, but like it applies to gadgets very often too, where it's just
Mm.
like, oh, what do you think about, the Apple Watch or the Aura Ring? Like, man, 50% of the time, like they already bought the thing. You know,
Yeah.
they're already gonna do it anyway. I kind of lean at this point actually more towards just encouraging the behavior.
Mm.
Again, that whole like autonomy piece. Like if it's something that's not going to be negative for them, which is most of the time, even if they're wasting a little bit of time, just feeling like they have autonomy, I think is probably more important. So, if they want to do it, like again, just full like disclosure, I don't think I'm necessarily like really good at this in practice, but at least like where I try to just move more and more over time is just supporting those three things that I mentioned earlier. And I think in an ideal scenario, like I would just support the person who wanted to try something, like whether it be creatine and maybe they don't have their diet down yet, maybe their training is lackluster, maybe their, nutrition is lackluster, but like, creatine is going to have other benefits for health. Like it's could just be an anchoring behavior where it's like, okay, now they have this one thing that they do every time. And in practice, you find that like the more specific it is, it's like you have to take, 3.5 grams of creatine 15 minutes before your training. I think when you listen to a lot of stories of people who, really built that sense of, like who really built up that intrinsic motivation and got to a high level, very early on, they were willing to do difficult things that didn't necessarily matter, whether it be that they were in the gym for, hours and hours on end and they were doing way more than they needed to, or they were taking the latest, greatest, supplement. Like it seems that the majority of people who make it far do end up doing that because the reality is they're just trying to check every box that they can. And like I mentioned earlier, it can be difficult to discern between the two people because also the other type of person asking that question isn't doing those behaviors. But I think in general, it's probably better to encourage people if they're excited about something because that still is that foundation of the pyramid in terms of just like, building that sense of, autonomy in a person that's going to lead to more, intrinsic motivation and, goal oriented behavior.
Yeah, and that's a good point to make, I think, broadly speaking, too, because it kind of illuminates the idea that you don't necessarily need to create this dichotomous scenario where you can take the supplement, but like you can't work on the other stuff that may also move them in that direction. And I think that that concept of, especially on social media, of just like holding two things that can be true or two things that can sort of occur concomitantly in your head at the same time, that is often sometimes difficult for people to, I think, wrap their heads around, where like you can have this sort of overly minute focus on, supplements or gadgets or whatever else, but that doesn't imply that you can't be working on the things that would maybe be like your higher ROI investment sort of topics.
Do it constantly.
Yeah. And I think that also, to your point, it is highly likely, I think, in a lot of those scenarios that that super nuanced, potentially not as helpful thing may actually create a stronger degree of, we'll say, commitment. Like you said, that this principle of sort of anchoring them in that sort of habit, it may create some sort of sense of intrinsic motivation, which may not otherwise exist had they not been able to focus on those kinds of things. So it may actually be sort of additive or multiplicative in a sense, if they didn't have that thing to begin with. Um, so anything that you feel like we maybe missed? I know we're sort of gonna start wrapping things up, just in terms of this conversation more broadly. Anything that you feel like, in terms of a specific example, would maybe be another helpful one to address, or another context that we didn't sort of touch on so far? Or do you feel like we pretty much covered what we wanted to with the overall conversation? I think we did a pretty good job. I think that maybe other than some more specific examples, like, we kind of, again, these are all sort of falling underneath of the same category, but just things like, nutrition timing, which you mentioned, like looking for perfect splits or looking for the perfect precise amount of, seconds that you need to do an eccentric on versus a concentric. All those things kind of, to me at least, fall into a similar bucket where, like you said, they're not necessarily things that in and of themselves are like prime movers of gross outcome, but sort of added all together may actually be more influential than maybe we give it credit for.
Yeah, and
Um,
I think like that's what I was looking back through, kind of the list of things we were, riffing on before. But like, it kind of becomes a self-limiting cycle where it's like, a person with high motivation keeps adding on these little details, at the top of the pyramid. And then eventually, they it sort of becomes fatiguing and they cut back on those things and they find a new set of behaviors. And you kind of keep just like, dwindling these things down, right? Like you throw in a bunch of clay and you carve it out. And I think, it's a cycle, but it's a cycle again that is exciting, and staying excited is a real key, to progressing long term. So I don't, I don't think there is anything, wrong to a degree with majoring in the minors when it keeps you excited, as long as you can keep, coming back to the foundations and sort of saying, okay, are my behaviors, still in line with that? Are any of these minors or any of these trees, sort of catabolizing the core concepts, right? Like if a core concept, for example, is just like having some, rest and downtime, like are you doing so many things that you're actually, cannibalizing that, right?
mhm.
And that, I mean, that is my process as well, right? Because that's where I tend to go, is just like doing too much and then just come back to home and it's like, well, if I did less, could I get more? And just, constantly going through that process of refinement where it's like you never have it right, you just add more things, you test those things, you take your best guess and your best ability to measure the outcomes. And a lot of times you come back to things that you had done previously and it's just this, not so much a cycle because you're not returning to the start, per se, but it is cyclical in the sense that you tend to focus on the minor things, come back to the major things, and that keeps things like that initial excitement that we had when we all started and were reading the magazines and trying out new supplements. I still feel that way to a degree. You know what I mean? Like I still do have a lot of moments where I'm like, oh, I can't wait to like, try this thing, see how it goes. And that's, you know, a big part of, staying in this thing term.
Yeah, so I think an important conclusion there to make is that it's not necessarily detrimental to subscribe to these sort of minor things, in really as long as you are sort of operating within a mindset which is like this story kind of never ends, like I never get to the conclusion, because the second that you get to the conclusion, that's when all things, I think sort of halt in terms of growth and progress, even if it's just revisiting the same things in a little bit of from a different sort of perspective. That's great. um and I'll wrap it up here by just giving an example of this in your case, where Ethan has recently introduced Skittle flavored Skittle flavored drinks into his intro workout, post workout. Okay, yeah. Which, for those listening, if you want to introduce some low calorie Skittle flavored Skittle flavored solutions,
Where are you going with this?
not, I'm just saying it's not a bad idea. It may be a minor consideration, but something for you at this point that's exciting. I
Oh yeah.
always find it
So
exciting.
the context is just like, okay, you're on a diet and you're finding little ways throughout the day to just kind of have like a reward, here and there. So I have this, like a sugar-free sweetener or a diet soda or whatever. And in this particular case, I pair it with a behavior. So the behavior is training. I tend to train later in the day. I find a lot of times the pre-workout is more of a ritual than it is necessarily like, a drug that you need. So a lot of times I don't need to be caffeinated later in the day, but I still like that ritual of, mixing up a shake, maybe having something sweet, being able to choose between, a dozen different flavors or whatever. And that's just kind of that signal, it's now time to shift states. And little things like that, I think we tend to do, sort of by accident. But when you really value the concept of just like keep things exciting, sometimes you can build things like that into your life on purpose.
Yeah, and I think that's a great conclusion, which is if you're looking to spice up your training, add some flavored drinks and it just let the rest sort of solve itself from there. All right, cool.